depths of Transylvania, in the 16th and 17th centuries, a woman named Elizabeth Bathory became known as the most prolific female serial killer in history. With rumors of her heinous crimes spreading far and wide, her name has become synonymous with evil and depravity. Some claim that she was a bloodthirsty vampire. Others say she was a madwoman, driven by her own twisted desires. But what really happened behind the walls of her castle, and what led to her downfall? Join us as we delve into the chilling story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, and uncover the truth behind one of history's most notorious figures. Stay tuned for our upcoming video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dark and fascinating tales from the past. Elizabeth Bathory was born into a world of privilege and wealth, the daughter of one of Hungary's most prominent families. From an early age, she was plagued with health problems that left her frail and weak. But despite her delicate constitution, she was exposed to unspeakable horrors that would shape her for the rest of her life. As a child, Bathory witnessed the brutal beatings of servants and even laughed at the sight of a man being sewn into the body of a horse for stealing. These events had a profound impact on her and may have contributed to her fascination with violence. At the young age of 10, she became engaged to a Hungarian count named Ferenc Nadasdy, who was 15 years old. She moved into her future husband's parents' place, where she received education on how to manage the estates under her mother-in-law's control. But even as she prepared to become a wife and a lady of high society, rumors began to circulate about a dark secret in her past. Legend had it that she had an affair with a peasant boy in her early teens and became pregnant. It is said that she gave the child away secretly. Meanwhile, her husband, Ferenc, was known for his cruel ways. He was supposed to have discovered the affair, had the peasant castrated, and then thrown to a pack of wild dogs. Despite the whispers and gossip that followed her, Bathory continued to ascend the ranks of society. She was known for her beauty, her wealth, and her influence in the court of Hungary. At just 14 years old, she married Ferenc in an extravagant affair, with 4,500 people in attendance. The party raged on for 3 days, and at the height of it, Ferenc gifted Elizabeth with a castle of her own, Castle Kestice. Castle Kestice was one of the darkest, most bleakly Gothic castles in all of Hungary, situated in the Little Carpathians in modern-day Slovakia. It would come to be the scene of many of Bathory's most horrific crimes. She and Ferenc bonded over their shared love of violence and torture, and he taught her innovative methods of inflicting pain on servant girls. But it was a woman named Anna Darvolia who had the most profound influence on Bathory's descent into depravity. Rumors circulated that Darvolia was a witch, and her arrival marked a dramatic change in Bathory's personality. She became even more sadistic, and Darvolia taught her how to kill. Under the tutelage of Darvolia, Bathory's cruel tendencies began to surface, and she was responsible for the deaths of several of her servants. But because peasants were considered disposable at the time, their disappearances went unnoticed. The name Elizabeth Bathory sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to speak it. She was the lady of Kestice Castle, a woman of immense wealth and power. And with that power came an insatiable thirst for blood. Despite her elevated status, rumors about her actions began to circulate. Local pastors grew suspicious as she requested more and more funeral rites for her deceased servant girls. One priest dared to confront her, warning that her actions were offensive to God, and that punishment would come if they didn't speak up. But Bathory was not one to be trifled with. She threatened him with her powerful connections and put an end to his interference. But it was after the death of her husband, Ferenc, that Bathory's behavior truly spiraled out of control. She became increasingly sadistic, torturing and murdering young women with the perverse pleasure that knew no bounds. With almost 400 servant girls at her disposal, she had no shortage of victims, but killing them posed a problem, as it meant she would have to replace them. So Bathory began to lure young women from the surrounding villages with the promises of employment and a better life. But once they arrived at the castle, they were subjected to unspeakable horrors. Burning, cutting, and beating were just a few of the tortures Bathory inflicted on her victims. Some were even forced to eat their own flesh. When she had finally had enough of their suffering, Bathory disposed of their bodies by throwing them over the castle walls to be devoured by wolves. It is believed that she killed over 600 young women in this manner. But she was not alone in her despicable actions. She had a loyal team of sycophants who facilitated her heinous crimes. Anna Darvolia was her main accomplice, but there were others, including the nurse who looked after the children, Ilona Joe, a friend of hers named Dorka, and a washerwoman named Catalin. However, the most sinister of her helpers were Anna and Dorka, who would try to outdo each other in inflicting pain on their victims. The youngest member of the murderous clan was a disfigured teen by the name of Fisco. The Countess had devised all manner of creative punishments to go with specific misdemeanors, and the typical progression of a servant girl into this horror would begin with a simple mistake in the performance of her duties. Once the Countess fixed an evil stare on the girl, she would yell at her and then begin slapping her around. Girls who made any kind of mistake in sewing would be repeatedly stabbed with long sewing needles. Usually, girls would be stripped naked before they were tortured, but Elizabeth Bathory didn't stop there. She reveled in inflicting psychological torture on her victims. She would stick needles into the fingers of a girl and then comment, "If it hurts the whore, she can pull it out." The girl would naturally take this as permission to pull the needle out, but when she did, Elizabeth would pull out a knife and cut the finger off. She was also known to have bitten a chunk of flesh from the face of one of her victims. Servants would be lucky to get away with just a lost finger or two. If the bloodlust within the depraved heart of the Countess could not be quelled, the victims would be dragged off to a torture chamber. It was here that Elizabeth employed her torture squad to carry out much of the dirty work. All manner of implements were used to cause the most gruesome afflictions imaginable. Pincers were used to rip the girl's flesh, the insides were torn out, and there have even been reports that cannibalism was enforced on some of the girls. The investigation and trial transcripts that occurred when fate eventually caught up with Elizabeth Bathory and her accomplices reveal certain details of what took place in the torture chambers of the Bathory castles. However, over the centuries, the legend took over, and many of the crimes attributed to her are mere fiction. One such myth is the belief that she had the blood drained from virgins and would bathe in it to preserve her youthful beauty. But this story is almost certainly untrue. Not one of the servant girls who testified against Bathory mentioned anything to do with the practice. Rather, account after account mentions that the floors of the torture chambers were covered in blood, which they would have to clean up. The Countess showed absolutely no interest in preserving the blood as part of some narcissistic beauty regime. By 1609, the whispers of her unspeakable acts had become deafening, the rumors of her insatiable thirst for blood and cruelty spreading far and wide. Countless peasant girls had been brutally tortured and killed, their bodies carelessly discarded in shallow graves throughout the castle courtyards. The law of the time prevented peasants from bringing charges against nobles, and even some parents sold their daughters to Elizabeth for a lump sum, fully aware of the horrific fate that awaited them. As the death toll continued to climb, Elizabeth's accomplices were struggling to find places to bury the bodies. Her closest confidant, Anna Darvolia, passed away from a stroke, leaving Elizabeth to face mounting debts and feelings of loneliness and desperation. In a twisted bid to find a new class of victims, she decided to open a finishing school for young noblewomen, where she could continue her sadistic ways under the guise of education. The tuition fees paid by the girls' parents would also provide a much-needed source of income for the Bathory family coffers. Elizabeth's killing spree went on for years, with no one daring to confront her. But eventually, the parents of some of the missing girls started to investigate. They went straight to the king, Matthias II, and demanded justice. The king ordered an investigation, and the man in charge was Gheorghe Thurzo, a close friend of Elizabeth's deceased husband. Thurzo was in a difficult position, torn between his loyalty to the king and his promise to Firenze. He began to interview witnesses and collect evidence. He heard stories of blood-soaked walls, screams of agony, and a growing cemetery in the castle courtyard, but he couldn't find an eyewitness to the torture. Thurzo was convinced of Elizabeth's guilt, but he knew that a public trial would tarnish the reputation of her noble family. To ensure justice was served, he made a secret agreement with Elizabeth's relatives, condemning her to a lifetime of imprisonment without a trial. Despite this, Thurzo was not satisfied. He knew that he had to expose Elizabeth's gruesome acts to the world. In December of 1610, Thurzo and the king were invited to dine at the Bathory castle, where Elizabeth attempted to poison them with a dessert cake. Thurzo returned on New Year's Eve with a contingent of armed guards and discovered the mutilated body of a young girl near the entranceway. 2 more bodies were found just inside, and the sound of screaming led them to the torture chamber, where Elizabeth's murder team was hard at work. Although Thurzo was not certain if he caught Elizabeth in the act of torture, he was convinced of her guilt. She was taken into custody and thrown into her own dungeon, where over 300 people testified against her, including members of her murder crew, who incriminated themselves in the process. The number of murders attributed to Elizabeth varied between 80 and 650. In January of 1611, Bathory's accomplices were put on trial, and death sentences were handed down. Ilona Jo and Dorka were given their own form of torture before their execution, while Fisco was beheaded and burned. Catalin was spared execution, but sentenced to life imprisonment. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was sentenced to life imprisonment in her own fortress, Castice Castle. She was locked away in one of the castle's dungeons, which had previously been the site of some of her horrific acts. Her only visitors during her imprisonment were the priest and Thurzo, the man who had brought her to justice. Despite their attempts to get her to confess, Elizabeth remained unrepentant and filled with anger. She refused to acknowledge the gravity of her actions and instead blamed her assistants. Even when Thurzo admonished her to use her remaining time to seek repentance, Elizabeth saved her deepest hatred for him. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth passed away in her cell. Her body was buried in the church cemetery at Castice, but it was reportedly exhumed and taken to the Bathory family crypt. However, when the crypt was opened in 1995, her remains were nowhere to be found, leaving yet another mystery to the already enigmatic tale of the Blood Countess. As we come to the end of this video, we can't help but feel a sense of intrigue and horror over the story of Elizabeth Bathory. Known as the Blood Countess, her gruesome acts have captivated and terrified people for centuries. While her story is undoubtedly disturbing, it also serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most privileged and powerful members of society. It's important to remember that justice was ultimately served in her case, and her victims were able to find some measure of peace. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the infamous Blood Countess. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more dark tales from history. And as always, stay curious.